Good morning, ladies and gentlemen and guests. It's a pleasure to welcome you to South East Technological University this afternoon. My name's Veronica Campbell and I'm the president of SETU, as we're called. This is a really important event on energy and the economy, and I'm really delighted that you've been able to join us here today. It's a pleasure for me to welcome those of you who are here in person, and also those of you who are joining us remotely and joining as a hybrid meeting. So welcome to you all this afternoon. So for those of you who are not so familiar with South East Technological University, let me just point out that our university was established on the 1st of May of this year, building on the very strong legacy of Waterford and Carlow Institutes of Technology. And we're now a community of 18,000 students and 1,800 staff, and we have very great ambition for our future. I'm very delighted that our School of Business has partnered with the European Commission representation in Ireland and European Movement Ireland to discuss matters that impact on the rate of progression to renewable energy. We are at such a critical time in Europe's energy security and sustainability, so it's very timely that this is part of a schedule of events that has been planned. Now, although SETU is a technological university with a very strong foundation and activities in science, engineering and technology areas, we also have extant strengths in arts, humanities and social sciences, including, of course, our School of Business. And this is really important as we take a multidisciplinary approach and a holistic view to addressing issues pertaining to clean energy. We need to think about things from the technical to the economic, from the cultural and the social. All those perspectives and all that expertise feed in to the renewable energy agenda and all the elements that surround that. This was really brought home to me earlier this week when I was in Brussels representing SETU at our European University Initiative, which is called EU Connexus. So this brings together ourselves and 8 other European universities who have a shared agenda on addressing smart urban coastal sustainability. And we're collaborating together on issues pertaining to the European Green Deal and the blue economy. And during the course of our discussions in Brussels, transnational collaboration, multidisciplinary calls to action were at the heart of that discussion, as well as the need to develop skills that are required for the future and the importance of industry and public agencies working with the university sector to find sustainable solutions. Through our education and research, SETU has an important role to play in addressing the multiple dimensions that underpin the transition to efficient clean energy. And by collaborating on events such as this today, we provide the forum and the intellectual capital for public debate on the interrelationship between energy and the economy in the context of today's geopolitical and environmental challenges. I'd like to welcome our expert panel here who are joining us today. It's my pleasure to have you here in SETU, and I wish everybody a very stimulating and engaging discussion. And with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce Tim Hayes, who's going to moderate this afternoon. Tim is Head of Communications at the European Commission representation in Ireland. So Tim, you're very welcome, and I'll pass over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you indeed very much, Veronica, and all here to this event, those of you who are here in person and those of you who are watching online. Today we're going to take some, or if you watch online, it's on the comment section of the YouTube, and we'll pass the messages then onto the panel. But just to put this in context a little bit, it's been sort of 2.5 or almost 3 years now since we in the Commission had the opportunity to come and speak to people around the country about what it is that's happening in Europe. And you know, sometimes the message doesn't get through very clearly, and sometimes it does get through very clearly. But in this context, we're looking at very strange times, because in February of this year, Russia decided illegally to invade Ukraine, and that has had a huge impact on the energy situation in the European Union. So we're trying to work together to resolve that on two levels effectively, to try and ensure that there's a supply of gas and electricity for the rest of the year, and to ensure that people make the best possible use of energy and don't waste energy. So this is what we're trying to get at, and what we've done today is we've brought together a panel of people with fantastic ideas on how to resolve these issues, not necessarily to resolve the war, because that's an issue that nobody can resolve for the moment, except unless the Russians pull out of Ukraine. I want to thank the European movement for organising this with us, and the SETU, I beg your pardon, for giving us the hall. For the speakers, we have Deirdre Clune on my left-hand side, and Deirdre is an MEP for Ireland South. She has been elected first in 2014, and she's a member of the European Parliament's Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection. She's also a substitute member of the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. And to add to that, Subcommittee on Human Rights and Special Committee on Beating Cancer. She's also a member of the Delegation for Relations with the countries of Central America and the delegation to the Euro-Latin American Parliamentary Assembly. So she's got a huge role within the European Parliament, so she spends a lot of her time in Brussels and in Strasbourg. She graduated from UCC in 1980, and she's a civil engineer by profession. She also did a diploma in management engineering in Trinity College in 1993. It's all here. Okay, and then she did a HDIP. She also, in addition to being a member of the European Parliament, she also was elected to the Dáil, and she sat in the Senate. So she's got a huge experience in all things European and all things to do with governance and elections and politics. Then we have our Waterford man here, Jim Power. Jim is really well known here. He worked as an economist for over 35 years. He is the owner and manager of Jim Power Economics, an economic and financial consultancy which he set up in 2019. He previously worked at AIB and the Bank of Ireland, and he's a board director of Love Irish Food. So he launched a podcast in February 2021, and this is a bit of a plug for his podcast. It's called The Other Hand, so it's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you normally get your podcasts. So well worth doing. Jim also writes articles for the Irish Examiner, which used to be the Cork Examiner, but it's now the Irish Examiner. Graduate of UCD, BA in Economic Science, and lectures full-time at the Smurfit Business School in UCD. He actually doesn't live in Waterford, he lives in Dublin, so he's come to Waterford today just to be here. Finally, our final panel member is Paddy Phelan, and Paddy is the CEO of the South East Energy Agency. He's also president of the Irish Energy Storage Association and the Irish Bioenergy Association. He is an executive committee member of the Irish Wind Farmers Association, a member of Chambers Ireland Low Carbon Task Force. So he has huge experience in the energy sector, from energy efficiency, energy management, renewable technologies. He's an industry expert in the retrofit process, with an emphasis on social housing since 2012. And he's got 10 years of EU project experience as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to ask each of the panel in turn to speak for between 7 and 10 minutes on this subject. And at the end of that, or during that, you can ask questions. You can use Slido to ask the questions. I can get the questions come in here on my phone. But I think what we will do is we'll listen to the three panel members first, and then we'll put the questions to all of them or each of them, as the case may be. So if we could start with Deirdre.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation to me. It's important to try and come back from Brussels and trying to explain exactly what is going on and what we're doing. Not to explain what the Commission is doing, but really to give you an insight into the thoughts that we're going through in the European Parliament, and indeed following the Commission's proposals on, as has been said, the rising cost of energy resulting from the war that's in Ukraine, and the result, particularly for us, for all Europeans, has been increased, as we know, in the price of electricity, It's linked to the price of gas, and it's having a really detrimental effect on households and businesses. And it's a real challenge, and it's one of the most important questions that we have in the Parliament. We're sitting next week in Strasbourg. It's number one on the agenda, as was last week as well. The war, as we know, last February has certainly put energy security supply into strong focus. And I would say in the group I sit in the European Parliament is the EPP group, and we have 180 members, and a lot of those members are from Eastern Europe. And they've been saying for the last number of years, don't trust Putin. Don't engage with him. He is going to do something that is just off the Richter scale, and that's what has happened. So maybe we should have listened, but here we are. So what has happened, as we all know, in an effort to try and support Ukraine, sanctions were introduced by the European Commission. Said we're not going to purchase Russian fossil fuels, mainly oil, gas and coal. And that, I mean, that's an easy statement to make. It's very easy for us to make here, or to support here in Ireland, because we get most of our gas from the UK. 70% of it comes from the UK, 30% from Carib. But if you're Germany, that's 100% dependent on your gas, for gas on Russia, which is about less than 50% of their requirements. So it's a big ask and a big question. Nonetheless, at the beginning, I would say there was a lot of from internal discussions from public statements as well by Germans. They didn't want to do it, obviously, because it would have a huge impact on their industry. But we have had moved to that point now where we're no longer coal. Oil is being reduced, and Germany has substantially reduced its dependence on gas from Russia. So, but more to go. But what were we going to do from a European point of view in terms of dealing with the issue? I mean, you've mentioned, Tim, Repower EU, which is an announcement by the Commission, how we're going to deal with the whole issue, not just on gas, but reduce our dependency on fossil fuels completely and speed up this green transition, which we've all voted for or bought into, every European country, that by the year 2030, which is only 8 years from now, we would reduce our emissions by 55% and then move to carbon neutral by 2050. So, that's to be speeded up now, and increasing the targets, and to move to being neutral by 2050. So it's been a challenge to cut gas, as I say, but so that's the challenge: cut our dependency on Russia, and also at the same time to keep the lights on. And how do we keep the lights on? Well, I'm going to use the word speed up renewables. I'm sure Paddy will have something to say about that too, and Jim, maybe. It's an easy statement to make, but how are we going to do it? And how are we going to get there? The immediate challenge, as you know probably from media, is how are we going to reduce our dependence on Russia, and LNG is one of the answers to that. Seeking further diversifying our supplies, trying to get further contracts. Looking at, well, the US is coming forward, Algeria, Azerbaijan, Qatar, Norway, countries that we hadn't a trading relationship with. But you see now for the first time that Europe, in terms of gas in particular, is attempting to purchase on behalf of all the member states, a central purchasing unit. That's what's coming from the debates we see almost every week now. You have an Energy Council meeting. You had an Energy Council meeting in Prague this week. You've building up to a full summit of the leaders of all the European states next week, the end of next week, 2021 of October. So to establish an energy purchasing unit on behalf of the EU, and this has come from COVID times. At the beginning, Europe was a little bit all over the place and didn't pull together. A bit like the example with Germany now today. But when we did pull together, Europe purchased vaccines on behalf of all the member states, and that, from an Irish point of view, was very beneficial. A small country, we wouldn't have been at the races competing with the bigger countries, and that's where we want to get to now, to get to that point whereby Europe purchase on behalf member states, and then the idea would be if you get every country to buy in, which we are moving there, and we are at that point agreeing on that. It's just a matter of putting the framework in place. Well, then you have a more credible purchaser, so markets will respond, and you also have a case where smaller member states, weaker member states won't lose out. So that's the idea. And of course, a lot of these ideas came from a political declaration in May, which said, we're going to purchase on behalf of the member states, we're going to reduce our dependency on Russia, we're going to need to diversify our supplies, we need to put a cap on electric prices, we need, and then it's a matter now for technical to make sure that that's delivered. But I think it was an important political statement to say, because another point needs to be made here is that the war was being bankrolled by the sale of fossil fuels to the EU. Last year, Europe spent 100 billion in purchasing energy requirements from Russia. So that was going straight to their war efforts as well this year. So that's they're the kind of proposals. LNG, as I say, it's good for. We don't have any LNG facility in Ireland. I think we should have, because we're always going to need. I mean, even if we get to 100% renewable energy, we will always need an emergency supply, a reserve of gas. Should there be a situation where we don't have any wind or we don't have any sun, but we will need that type of emergency supply. And also LNG facilities can be changed to accommodate hydrogen as well in the future. So I would have been supportive of that, even though I know it's not government policy at the moment, but there is talk of we may have a floating LNG facility. They're good for coastal countries like ourselves. So also want to speed up the deployment of wind and solar, and you've made a notice this week. This week we are in the 11th of October week, but the government announced that no longer would solar panels require planning permission for businesses and for households, which is a good thing. But we need to try and, so that's one of the ambitions of this Repower EU from the Commission, to try and speed up the deployment of the use of renewables, and we need to do that. We need to cut the green tape or the red tape, because it takes an average a wind farm, and my experts here will be able to tell you that, how long to get full planning permission. 9 years, a solar power farm 4 years. It's the same for here as across Europe as well. So that's the proposal from the European Commission. Immediately, short term, try and go out there and buy gas on behalf of Europe. I mean, I was reading yesterday in Azerbaijan, they had European representatives, and they had something from the European Commission. They had German finance, our energy minister, and they had Greek energy minister. So lots of visits. All these countries have become very important now in terms of providing supply in the short term for this winter. Next winter is going to be a problem as well, as we all know. So that's and we don't know where this war is going or how it's going to end. But I think you have to act to ensure that we actually move away from fossil fuel dependency as quickly as we can. So I mean, politically, a lot across Europe, there's lots of fractions and lots of different well, not fractions I wouldn't say, but people have different opinions, and different countries have different opinions. The issue of putting a price cap on energy is being discussed. I think there's some agreement, although we have opposition from Netherlands and Germany, but we're moving towards an agreement on that. And of course, the Commission asked member states to tax what we call the windfall profits. There will be profits from energy companies who are using maybe solar, wind, nuclear, and because energy is linked to the price of, or because electricity is linked to the price of gas, then they're receiving profits now that they hadn't anticipated. So they're all part of the solutions at the moment. But from a what would you say, from a medium to long-term point of view, we have to move away from our dependency on fossil fuels. I mean, I hear all the time that we're a good country and we have the Saudi Arabia of Europe with our wind power, with our potential for wind power. That may be the case, but we have to harness that wind power. and harness that energy and harness that wind power to deliver for ourselves. And you know, we're dependent on, we get our gas from the UK, which we're fine, we are, but are we really fine? You know, we're still Europeans, and what if they have North Sea, they get supplies from Norway. What if potentially Norway, as a member of the European Economic Area, was asked by Europe to be a dedicated customer to them? Would that have implications for the UK? They're talking, so we don't know. There's a lot of uncertainties there. But I would just maybe finish, because and hand over to the real experts, but just to say that from our point of view, as a small nation on the west of Europe, to be part of a European solution to this is the way forward, because we are much better pulling together rather than hanging separately. But I think they've been from my opening remarks, Tim, and be happy to engage with the Q&A afterwards, that I'm sure will lead us in other directions.
Okay, thanks very much, Deirdre. And I think the important thing to take from what Deirdre was talking about there was the unity of the member states of the European Union in the face of the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Putin. And the European Union didn't want to be seen to be financing that war by continuing to purchase fossil fuels from Russia. And in fact, this time last year, about 40% of European gas was purchased from Russia, and that is now at 9%. So you can see that we are gradually cutting off the subsidization of the Russian armaments industry, the Russian war industry, by ensuring that Putin doesn't continue to get financed or subsidized, if you wish, by the European Union. So that's a really important task, and I think Deirdre clearly pointed out the unity within the member states on that. There are certain disagreements around the edges, but generally speaking, absolute unity. So listen, thanks very much for that, Deirdre. Jim, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks very much, Tim. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You pick me up on the mic? Yeah, okay. Good afternoon. Delighted to be here in SETU. I'm from about 25 kilometres out the road in a rural parish called Clonea-Power. Still has senior hurling status for the moment, at least. But it's like 1922 out there at the moment. You drive through the parish, there are signs up about don't let solar destroy our community. A few farmers have come together to try and develop a solar farm, and it's causing civil war. I was asked last April to go down and chair a town hall meeting. I politely declined because I knew I'd be lynched if I actually went out there and expressed what I really believe on the subject. But it shows you the opposition to that solar farm development is quite extraordinary, and it shows the difficulty in driving a renewable energy agenda in this country. You know, the spirit of NIMBYism is alive and well, and that is something that has to be tackled. And I know people have legitimate reasons as to why they might object to something, but at the end of the day, given the crises we're facing at the moment, and to me, the two biggest national crises are housing, and we saw the students outside at 11 o'clock expressing their views on that issue, and the second one is energy and the future security of energy supply. So we all have to accept things we mightn't like for the greater good, and the greater good to me is, number one, creating a long-term strategic view on housing, delivering that. Secondly, it is creating and delivering a long-term strategic view on energy security in the future. The International Energy Agency defines energy security as the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. So, you know, we need affordable energy, we need reliable energy, and I think what we should have learned over the last 8 months is that we need an energy source that is not dependent on the whim of political lunatics. And the problem, of course, is that if you look around at a lot of oil and gas producing countries, they tend to be characterized by political lunatics. You know, Venezuela, a major oil producing country, Saudi Arabia, I'd have pretty strong views on human rights, etc. and of course Russia with Putin. So that is a fact of life, that these countries, and there are good economic and sociological reasons why this is the case, but a lot of the primary energy producing countries are ruled by pretty unstable and dangerous political regimes. So we've got to reduce our dependence on that. But I go back to the point, it's an uninterrupted, reliable supply of energy. Okay, and for the Irish economy, there is a narrative out there that Ireland is a failed state, but the reality is, Ireland has been incredibly successful in terms of over 2.55 million people working at the end of June this year. We have an unemployment rate of 4.3%. We have 275,000 jobs directly dependent on the multinational sector, foreign direct investment, a lot of them here in Waterford, and another 220,000 jobs dependent on those. So we do have problems. Show me a country in the world that does not have problems. Even a country like Sweden, that is often thrown out there as the exemplar in terms of socioeconomic policy. But Sweden is on the brink of electing a pretty far-right government at this juncture. The Italians are doing the same, but there's no surprises there. But with Sweden, you would be quite surprised. But it just shows you, Ireland has a pretty successful model. And I think energy and the reliability of energy is going to be crucial to maintaining the attractiveness of Ireland for foreign direct investment as a place to invest, as a place to create jobs. So there's a huge economic imperative to get the energy thing right. But there is also a huge social imperative, because energy is absolutely crucial, not alone to a functioning economy, but also a functioning society. There are two, I think, key imperatives driving this energy debate and this energy security question. One is obviously the climate change agenda, and COVID-19, I guess, was the biggest challenge of a lifetime. But I think climate change is much more fundamental. It threatens our survival as a race, both in the short, medium and long term. So the climate change agenda cannot be lost sight of. It is absolutely crucial to address that. So that's one element of the energy debate. The second element, as I see it, is the energy security question. We've discovered in the last 8 or 9 months just how dependent we are on Russian energy. I know we don't import gas directly from Russia. We are connected to the UK grid, and that of course poses its own problems if you want to talk about political basket cases. But I think the point is that Russia has an incredible energy hold over the European Union. And although we're not directly tied into it, this is a global market. So if Europe is having problems, the EU, Ireland will have problems. It is a global market. That should not be lost sight of. I guess as an economist, you'd probably be very disappointed if I didn't bombard you with a lot of juicy statistics. And I think these juicy statistics, tell quite a story. The European Union imports 50% of the energy that it consumes. And then if you look at the breakdown of the energy that it consumes, oil and petroleum, 35% of energy consumed, natural gas, 24%, renewables, just 17%. Way too low in my view. Nuclear is 13%, and then solid fuels 11%. So you can see the energy mix in the European Union is still heavily biased towards fossil fuels. And from a climate perspective, but I also think from an energy supply perspective, security perspective, that is not an acceptable situation. And then if you look specifically at the European Union's dependence on Russia, 24% of the energy Europe, the EU, consumes comes from Russia. 46% of natural gas imports, 26% of crude oil, and 19% of solid fossil fuels come from one country. And unfortunately, that is a country that is now causing serious global problems, and energy supply out of Russia has now become a strategic weapon of Putin in his savage war against Ukraine. So I think it's important never to lose sight of that. In terms of going back to the Irish economic story, we've seen the impact that the energy crisis over the last 8 months is having on the Irish economy. The latest inflation numbers for September were released at 11 o'clock today. The Irish inflation rate has dropped back to 8.2%, 8.2%. And I haven't seen the breakdown, but I assume it's because oil prices have slipped back in the last couple of months, and that's now starting to reflect itself at the petrol pumps and diesel pumps. But if you look at the year to August, an 8.7% unemployment rate, electricity prices up 38.1%, natural gas prices up 59.6%, solid fuels 31.9%, petrol 23.5%, diesel 34.6%. So you can see that roughly 2/3 of the cost of living crisis here, which was the dominant theme in the budget a few weeks back, is down to energy. So energy is a huge contributor to the cost of living crisis. So and it will be again in the future, regardless of what happens in Russia and Ukraine. So we need to address that issue. If you look at the broader impact on business, I mean, we see, I live in Dublin and 4 restaurants around me have shut down in the last few weeks, and it's largely because of the energy crisis. There are other factors, but energy is instrumental in the causing these business closures. And if you listen to any realistic business debate out there, energy costs are becoming a major issue. As somebody coming from a farming background, I guess I have to focus in specifically on what's happening on the agriculture side. I just checked out the latest agricultural input prices, and this tells a story as well. Energy costs for farmers up 40.8%, electricity 38.1%, motor fuels 43.3%. So you just see again and again how this energy crisis, the cost of energy particularly, is having such a significant impact on households and on businesses. And I said at the beginning that it is up there with housing, in my view, as one of the 2 biggest crises and challenges facing this country. And every juicy statistic I throw out, I think, it strengthens that argument. Okay, that I think that is irrefutable. Ireland is heavily reliant on imported energy. 71% of the energy we consume is imported. That is the 8th highest in the European Union. And for a country, an island economy off the west coast of Europe, where wind is a huge resource, that is a ridiculous situation to be in, to be perfectly honest. So wrapping it up, I mean, I think the economic imperative here to address energy security is pretty obvious. And if you want to sort of research that a little bit, just check out what the IDA has been saying about energy as a driver of what it does. If you look at the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, every year it produces an annual competitiveness report, and the most recent one in September, there's a huge focus in there on energy as a hugely important source of national competitiveness. So energy is absolutely crucial. And then the government every year publishes what's called a national risk assessment, and it looks at the key risks to Ireland. And since 2014, housing and energy have been highlighted as significant strategic risks for the Irish economy and for Irish society. So we really do need to focus very strongly as a country on this issue of energy security. And I repeat the definition: it is the uninterrupted supply of reliable and affordable energy. That's where we need to get to. And how do we get there? It's easy to stand up here and throw out all these platitudes. But how do we get there? Well, to me, there is no single silver bullet solution. You know, wind isn't going to solve the problem. Solar is not going to solve the problem. It has to be a portfolio of different energy sources, so that when the wind isn't blowing, something else kicks in, and so on. So what would that portfolio look like? Well, offshore and onshore wind, particularly offshore wind. We've set ourselves fantastic, ambitious targets in the Climate Action Plan last year, but official policy doesn't back it up. You know, the whole regulatory environment, the planning system, makes it really difficult to deliver offshore energy. Solar has to be part of the equation, and I mentioned the civil war out in my parish, Clonea Power, but a few years ago I did a rural economic development program in Boston College in the United States, and as part of that we went down and spent some time in North Carolina, and the place is full of solar farms. I drove through California recently, full of solar farms, and indeed wind farms as well. I don't see the problem. If you accept the challenge, and we have got to accept stuff that we mightn't like necessarily. I live beside a bloody national school in Dublin. I'd much prefer if it wasn't there, but kids have to be educated. And I say that from a traffic perspective. And the reason why I really say it is because I was on the board at that school for a number of years, and by definition, every kid in that school comes from within 2 kilometres of the school, and yet the traffic chaos in the morning. And that kind of tells us something about our behaviour as human beings. We're great at protesting about climate change, but yet we've got to change our behaviour. And I'm constantly running around our house now telling me 2 sons to turn off lights. You're funding Putin's war. It has become a joke at this juncture. But anyway, solar, biomass, ethanol in motor fuel, something Ireland has been very reluctant to take on board because we believe that we can have 100% electric vehicles. A great target to have, impossible to deliver within any realistic time frame. And here again, we have the disconnect at a government level. They set these EV targets, they forget to put the infrastructure in place to charge those electric vehicles. I mean, we're putting the cart before the horse. And then those of a certain age this might resonate for most of you here. To go straight over your heads. We need to leave Christy Moore behind. Nuclear has got to become part of the national energy debate. And unfortunately, but it's the reality, fossil fuels will still have a role to play as well. You can't just suddenly decide no more fossil fuels without putting alternatives in place. So I'll shut up at this stage, but a diversified, stable, reliable source of energy is essential from a climate perspective and from an energy security perspective.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jim. As I say, it was an absolute tour de force, and thanks so much for the statistics that you threw in there. And I particularly like the reference to Carnsore Point, which probably went over, as you say, most of these people's heads, but nevertheless, the bottom line that I took from your presentation was that we really need to move away from fossil fuels for energy, and we need to move more towards renewables. But in that renewables package, you're not excluding nuclear as part of that. So listen, thank you so much for that, Jim. We move on to our final speaker, and the final speaker is Paddy Phelan, CEO of Southeast Energy. Paddy, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to break with previous 2 speakers, not like maybe with Jim's ability to give statistics without a picture. I think it feeds nicely into perhaps what I can tell you and hopefully bring to bear in the context of the Southeast region, because that is where we are. And that is where I suppose I spend most of my time. I suppose, again, a bit like Jim, I'm originally from the region, albeit a Tipperary man rearing cats living in Kilkenny. So that brings with it its own challenges. But to that effect, just to briefly introduce where I work. So it formerly was the Carlow Kilkenny Energy Agency, and through iterations of partnership and working with, it has now moved to become the Southeast Energy Agency. So just the slides there, I don't have control, so the next slide just pictorially shows that. But quickly moving on, just a couple of statistics which are helpful in the context of what Jim has said. So I'm not sure whether Jim got sight of my slides before he came on or not, but I think they're gelled together quite well in terms of the energy statistics. So just in terms of the southeast region, and before anybody asks why is South Tipperary not in there, that was a decision made in Europe in 2014 that the southeast region under NUTS 3 now is Carlow, Kilkenny, Wexford and Waterford, and Tipperary with North Tip is in the Midwest. So that's the context of that. But we're dealing with 422,000 people, and fundamentally we've identified that there can be a number of jobs created in this sector within this region. So I'm giving you a regional perspective. The next slide, please. So coming back to international policy, and what Deirdre gave us a very, very real, at the moment, within crisis scenario that's been discussed and operated in Europe, and how to get decisions and how to get the union. I think that's really useful for us to appreciate. That's the benefit of a union, that we can work together. But I think it's important to note that Europe set their stall out many, many decades ago in this whole energy sector, and it's been particularly, I suppose, targeting increased percentages of renewable energy, but also, more importantly, looking at energy efficiency. And sometimes we forget about energy efficiency. And really, energy efficiency plays a big part in this overall challenge as well. So I think it's important. But just in terms of the Green Deal and all of the policies that are there before the Ukraine war, there's just a list of them on that slide all around, and it affects everything. So all the action plans from Farm to Fork, from biodiversity strategies, CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, all of those all feed back into this European Green Deal. And I think importantly, it's showing a commitment at the European level, pre-war times, to us cleaning up our act in Europe and becoming energy independent. And I think what the Ukraine war has done is it's brought this into severe focus. And I suppose from my perspective, there's no such thing as a good war, but an ill-willed, for us, will accelerate this energy security and low carbon. Next slide there, please. So again, just to look at the various steps, and this is, 2019 is long before Putin decided to move in. So you had the Clean Energy Package, you had the European Green Deal, which is the Fit for 55, and now you have the Repower EU. And this has accelerated the targets to show that originally we were saying 40%, moving up to 45%, but more importantly, a commitment around money. So a massive amount of money being pushed in this direction to support the Union and the members of European Union member states to get on with this and to move it into action. Because we're looking, and this is something we've identified at a national level as well as at an international level, we have plans coming out our ears. We have ideas coming out our ears, but in actual fact there's been very little action on the ground. And that's borne out in the statistics that Jim has shown at a European level, that 17% of European energy comes from renewables. I hadn't realised it was that low because the 2020 target was higher than that. So Europe as a whole has actually missed its target. Okay, the next slide. So I won't delve into, but the Irish Climate Action Plan is in place since 2019, and there was a lot of good work done in 2019 under Minister Bruton at the time, when a sector that needed to get organised, and the minister got in and got down and got a plan up and got a lot of stuff moving around supports in the Irish context. And that plan in 2019 set about auctions. It originally set a 70% renewable energy target, and that's been increased to 80%. It identified offshore wind, all of the various methodologies, and Jim has touched them, so I won't delay, around electrification of vehicles, electrification of transport, heating homes using heat pumps. But again, from my perspective, and to put balance on it, it's very electricity focused. So what I'm going to take you through briefly now, which hopefully will support us in the context of what we're going to discuss in the panel, and the next slide again there, please, and you can jump past that one. That's just a useful slide, and I'm assuming they'll be circulated after the event for people to reference. So what we decided to do about 8 months ago, with the support of a European Interreg project called Reg Energy, which is rural energy supply meeting urban energy demand in the context of the southeast region. So what we completed was a high-level helicopter view of the potential renewable energy supply for the southeast region within the 4 counties. And you can see there, wind has a potential to do 1,609 gigawatt hours, solar has a potential to do 1,317, and so on and so forth. But if you actually look at the note on the right-hand side, the biogas currently accounts for 8.9% of the, or can account for 8.9% of the overall in the region, but it could be increased to 6.88 gigawatt hours, or in effect, over half of the energy demand of this region alone. And there's just one opportunity. It's not electrification. It's a rural resource that could be potentially harnessed and brought to bear. So potential energy, and it's something engineers and any of you in the room who've been in my classes over the various energy courses, you'll understand when I talk about potential energy, and again plans, moving them into action. So kinetic energy, energy that's actually usable and, you know, in this context, clean. Moving on, there's just a pie chart there of where the energy in this region. So Jim gave an outline of where the energy comes from in Europe. But if we take a regional, and a lot of the European policy is looking at how the regions, or how, you know, the municipalities can build it up from the bottom, and community involvement, getting the communities, so getting the people who feel like this is all at a European level or this is all at a national level, but you know, at a local level. So as you can see, transport is our biggest, 34%. And if you look at that in the context of, you know, we've future-proofed that in terms of where we can get our renewables from. But as you can see, residential transport are the two big ones, with industry coming in behind. And then the others are the smaller ones. So really what we say is when you focus on the big ones, you're starting to make progress. So residential homes, it's not just a housing problem, it's actually the performance of our housing is also a problem. And, you know, joined up thinking about when we're tackling retrofit, we're also bringing homes back into use. So you see statistics recently, and Jim would know these well, the number of vacant houses, and there was an action in the budget there recently to try and increase the tax on homes that are empty, whether they're derelict homes or homes that have just, you know, passed on generations and haven't been brought back into use. So it's making the most of what we have. This is what we call potential and moving it into action. Okay, moving along there. The important bit to remember is that the Paris Accord and the agreement has now come into legislation in Ireland, and it's binding. So we now have a carbon ceiling, sectoral emissions in every sector. And you will have heard the debate over the summer about how much of the heavy lifting agriculture is going to do in this region. Agriculture came to the table and agreed 25% in their sector. But across the southeast region, we've looked at where, on the top slide, where it needs to be in 2030, so it needs to compress. And on the bottom pictorial there, it's the 2020. So the sectoral emissions, tonnes, and the sector they come from. So moving along, again, just some useful stuff for us to consider, and where the potential energy can come from. So again, there's a lot of detail there, I won't go into it, but fundamentally we were looking at biogas as part of this topic. And I'm not suggesting that biogas is the only solution, it's just one within the time we have that we've said, well, policy-wise across Europe, it's wholesale, it's everywhere. Biogas is complementing industry, it's complementing agriculture. North of the border, biogas is complementing agriculture, complementing industry. Unfortunately, in Ireland, it seems to be in a policy blind spot. And we're trying to understand that and move that forward. And Repower EU, at a European level, has significantly increased its requirement for renewable gas. Why? Because suddenly gas, and I call it fossil gas, and a lot of the people in the gas industry go, no, it's natural gas. I say, no, it's fossil gas. And it should be renamed so. Because until people appreciate where their gas is coming from, they can't understand whether it's clean or not clean, and so on and so forth. Again, moving along, just in terms of the potential around production. So oftentimes, and going back to my slide about farm to fork, farm sustainability, food production, if we produce gas from biogas, we're going to impact food production. But what we've completed here is an assessment, and for my sins, I'm a part-time, very much part-time, that's my 10 minutes, but a very much part-time tillage farmer, and I appreciate the cropping and opportunities around it. So what we've built up there is the potential. So we're not saying get rid of the dairy industry. We're not saying get rid of, you know, the tillage industry. We're saying get them to work with each other. Get them to complement each other. Double cropping on tillage farms, on the stubble from the harvest right through to the spring crop, and the potential that produces. Bringing back the beet industry. You know, there's been several attempts to bring beet back in as a natural Irish well-grown product that instead of going into sugar could go into energy, and it provides a good break crop, whereas now we're producing oilseed rape is the main break crop, and that's running into sort of chemical and pesticide problems in terms of managing it. So moving along, there's another slide there in the biomass potential, and then if you move along, and I think this is just an example. So we've got EU funding. There's a biogas plant in Portlaw, and we in the Energy Agency have applied to Europe, got funding to put the gas canisters, so moving this gas by road because it's not connected by a network. So before Christmas there will be gas canisters filled in Portlaw, delivered to Enniscorthy and to New Ross and to Kilkenny City to power 2 local authority buildings from gas produced within the county. Now everyone says you can't do this, and we were sick of listening to you can't do this, so we went to Europe and we got some funding to do it. Now there will be problems, there will be challenges, there will be legislative restrictions, but by doing these little pilots, and that's some of what we do within the Energy Agency. But moving along, and I think this is the critical piece, and you can go, if we look at our existing electricity supply and demand, we're in good condition today. We have just about enough wires to supply the power that the college here needs, that the industry needs. So in the southeast region generally, it's a bit tight in spots, but it'll work. However, if you fast forward on the next slide and you look at the 2030 requirements, when you move all the electric vehicles onto it, when you move all the homes from heat pumps, when you increase the demand on policy for existing oil and gas industries to move to electrification, so that's a huge increase in energy demand. So currently Ireland energy supply is about 23% from electricity, and our current policies are pushing that closer to 45 or 50%. We need the wires to do that. And unfortunately in the southeast about 8 or 10 years ago, there was a plan for a big 400 kVA increase in terms of capacity for airgrid. It didn't go ahead. So we're somewhat constrained in how we go forward. So what we've identified is really that there needs to be a significant infrastructural investment for us to future-proof this region. And I think the same applies in Europe. And this is where the money is purported to go in terms of REPowerEU and other elements of aspects in that. But for all of this to happen, there are 3 legs to that stool. You must have a policy that supports it, because we all appreciate to get renewable energy off the ground is very challenging. And if there isn't a policy there to do it, then it's very hard to do. Secondly, you need a licence, so you need planning permission. But thirdly, in nearly all instances, you need a grid connection. And at the moment, our grid capacity is not capable of dealing right now with the policies in terms of, and it's become really in the media in the last week when EirGrid brought out again their future capacity statement. And a little bit of the tradition in Ireland is for one act to blame the other and one element to blame. I personally believe that instead of EirGrid saying it's the regulator, or the regulator saying it's EirGrid, or the regulator or EirGrid saying it's the government, I think that we're in such a crisis scenario right now that all of these people need to get together. The evidence is there, it's been completed in other jurisdictions, the policies need to change, but more importantly, and this feeds back into Jim's park, the markets. The markets were designed 6 years ago in terms of the regulators, and this is where the caps are coming in Europe. But for a developer to build, and EirGrid came out last week and said, oh, the developers didn't turn up with the wind farms, they didn't turn up with the solar parks. The reason they didn't turn up is because the markets didn't enable them to. It stopped them from being able to build the projects that they already had permission to do. Not to mind the ones that are coming forward, because markets move, situations change, and as a result, we haven't found ourselves coming into this winter sufficiently stocked with renewables, which are actually consented. They're ready to build, but they weren't built in the last 12 or 18 months because the markets have jumped all over the place and the support schemes and policies. So I think the really important thing to note here, and to round it into 2 aspects at a high level. Jim mentioned there economic imperative, competitive and security of supply. So competitivity index of Ireland is affected, but I think it's really, or the competition index, I think it's really important to appreciate that Ireland as it stands right now in the context of its European friends is the laggard in terms of emissions. And 68% of the emissions come from energy. So we've been the green isle, and we have a great reputation internationally for decades about being a green isle, but we really run not just an issue around competitiveness, but we also have a big issue around, credibility. And everything we look at now is looking at the three big letters ESG: environment, sustainability, and governance. And really, fundamentally, my point is we have the potential in the southeast region. That's replicated nationally, and it's actually replicated right across Europe, because many of the regions in Europe are not that dissimilar to ours, and we see them all the time. So the potential energy is there. There's now a big European drive in terms of Repower EU to support and finance this. What we need to do now at a local and a regional level is to put the policies, get the licensing in place, and get on with building it, and making sure that the next generation are not found themselves in the context that we have in 2022. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paddy, and thank you in particular for sort of bridging that gap between what happens at EU level, EU policy, and what needs to happen at a local level. I think that's really, really important. Now, the questions have been pouring in on Slido. We have about 15 or 20 minutes or so to try and get through as many of them as we can. But one of the more interesting ones that I see here, and it's addressed to the whole panel in fact, but maybe I'll address it towards Jim. And both of us, when we started speaking, we spoke about the reason that fuel prices have gone up, or energy prices have gone up, has been because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And a question here wants to know, is there a direct link between the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the increase in energy prices?
Yeah, there is a direct link, because these are global energy markets, and if you have a global supply shock, the price is going to rise. And unfortunately, the way electricity particularly is priced, it is the marginal production that sets the price, and gas is the marginal producer of electricity. So it's the gas price that dictates what we pay on our electricity bills. So there is an absolutely direct effect.
Okay, and controversial. There is no.
Oh, there is absolutely.
And I'm correct in saying that about 60% of Irish electricity production is by means of gas. Something like that.
Yes, it's around that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a question here for Paddy. Paddy, do you believe community and local energy projects are central to a low carbon transition?
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I suppose it's something we deal with every day, and it's something that's been core and centre in terms of the discussion and these plans I've mentioned that require action. So communities have a role to play, absolutely, and they can and are enabled to get involved and to participate. I think if I was asked this question without my energy hat on and without the Energy Agency and our role in terms of supporting communities, I think there are horses for every courses, and I think communities do have a role to play, but I think it's a role at the sub 5 megawatt level. So when I say sub 5 megawatt, a 5 megawatt wind farm will produce, or a 5 megawatt solar farm is quite a relatively small project in the context of Europe and our energy demand and what potential supply can come from it. So for us to meet and have energy security, we need big projects as well. So I don't think communities should be exposed to the risk, and there's significant risk associated with developing renewables, particularly in the context of the markets I mentioned. So communities should be enabled and are enabled, and under the Irish legislation and the current policies, are enabled in a subset, almost a protected market, to get involved. And they should be encouraged to do so. But they should not enter in there expecting that there aren't any risks in doing so, because a market requires that people fail. If people don't fail, well then the market is not a real market.
Okay, excellent. Deirdre, I have a question for you. The question makes a reference to a poll published in September, which said that 58% of the people questioned said that we should stop or delay the meeting of the environmental targets, and that appears to be the view that Irish people have, is that we're moving too quickly to achieve the environmental targets. Do you think that the EU is moving too far too quickly and imposing too much stuff on Irish people?
No, I don't think so. I think we have targets to 2030 and in fact they have been increased now, and we have targets to 2050. Now it's easy to set the targets and it's easy to do it, but to vote for targets and say get on with it, but it's a matter of implementing it then. And with this Repower EU now, as we said, there's actually direct funding to support that. Just to read the question, no, I don't think we are. I don't think we have a choice. We've seen the way climate has gone this summer. I mean, look at the droughts in some countries, excessive temperatures, 48, 46 degrees in the south of Spain. The world is changing, and if we don't keep it at the increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade, we're in real trouble. So I don't think we're moving. I don't know if we're moving too quickly, but we have to put these structures. We have to do it. There's an imperative to do it, and but there has been some pullback really in terms of the targets 2030 to maybe to flatten the curve, if you like, to get to those points, but not we don't have to do it immediately. 23, 24, make it more gradual. But I think I don't think we have a choice but to get to.
You think maybe a better communications campaign by the government to persuade people that we have to get there?
Well, well, we have to get there, yeah, but then what it means, we do have to get there, and I'm hearing that we have to get there, but then I'm supposed to, what Jim has talked, Jim's experience, I mean, Jim, your experience in Clonairy Power, that was about, how we're going to implement, if we believe, which all the science tells us, I think that's unrefuted, that we are going to suffer a catastrophic consequences unless we do it. Then I think we have to do it as an onus for the next generation. Yeah, but in what we call this just transition, that people, particularly the agriculture sector now is going to change, but there is support there to do that. I mean, the latest round of CAP now is 25% of the payments will be linked to the environment sector, but they have to be supported in that rather than told, this is it, this is your target, get on with it.
Okay. Super. Jay, I have a question for you. You mentioned earlier about the impact of energy prices on inflation. And the question is, if energy prices were capped, what impact would that have on inflation? Does that mean that everything would come down and we'd have more money to spend on everything else?
Okay, in relation to the first question, I'd like to just clarify one thing. I was asked the question, was there a direct link between the Ukraine war and energy prices? There is, but it's not the only cause. During the 2 years of COVID disruption, energy supply was also seriously disrupted. So in a sense, back in January, February, we had an energy price problem, and then that was totally compounded dramatically by the Ukraine situation. So it was a problem coming on top of a pre-existing problem. In terms of the question you asked me,
price cap.
Price cap, absolutely.
Affected inflation.
Yeah, there was a lot of pressure on the Irish government coming into the budget on September 27th to introduce a price cap. We didn't. We put in place subsidies instead. Okay, the UK, on the other hand, went for an energy price cap. You see how the markets have reacted to that. It's not the only reason in the UK, but it's total chaos. It was writing a blank cheque. It was nuts, in my view. And the last time we in this country signed a blank cheque, which was with the banking guarantee, we know where that got us. So putting an energy cap in place would have been signing a blank cheque. I think it's a much more prudent approach to as long as the energy cost of living crisis persists, that government continues to intervene with financial support. I think it's a more sensible strategy.
But what about purching a cap on the purchasing price that's talked about now?
Well, the Norwegians,
the purchasing of energy.
The Norwegians would argue that it is actually going to further disrupt the supply. They would say that, wouldn't they, given that they supply most natural gas? Yeah. But The problem here is that this is a crisis we're dealing with in the here and now. Yeah. And if you introduce measures like that, what happens then when energy prices fall? I mean, 10 years ago we had oil prices down at $20 a barrel or wherever, even 3 years ago actually. So when these energy companies start to make losses, should the state then step in and subsidise? I mean, I think a price cap, from a populist political perspective, it sounds very attractive, but I think the practical implementation and implications would be really, really difficult. And the thing it could also seriously result in is disrupting supply further.
Okay, and of course you haven't been advising the government in this regard at all. It just so happens that your view agrees with theirs.
Oh, zero. I have nothing to do with government.
I just wanted
Absolutely.
to
No.
clarify that. Okay. Okay, I have a question here for Paddy.
They wouldn't listen to me anyway.
A question for Paddy, and it's actually about what we're thinking about in new forms of fuel. We're thinking about hydrogen here in this context, and the question is: do you think that hydrogen is a feasible area of energy for energy security, or do you think it's more of a long-term plan? I mean, what's your view, generally speaking, about hydrogen? And this is something that the President of the European Commission spoke about in her State of the Union address last month about putting more money into hydrogen.
I do believe hydrogen has a role to play, but I mean, if I reference, Fraunhofer did a very detailed assessment of the role of hydrogen, for example, in the built environment. So that's where you use hydrogen to heat and operate buildings or industry, and they found that the life, the whole cycle, life cycle cost, and the round trip efficiency of producing hydrogen and then bringing it to buildings to use it, to whatever vector it can go, is very difficult to make it stack economically. And actually, one of the fundamental economic criteria on producing hydrogen is the price of electricity. So I'll counter that by saying, if we were to develop a significant portfolio of offshore wind, and I believe there should be a more significant portfolio of onshore wind, and I was delighted to see a project in South Kilkenny get approval last week at Bord Penala, because despite all of this issue that everyone has in terms of projects onshore and offshore, if you look at times of use, so you hear the government and you hear the regulator since the 1st of October has forced the utilities, so those who sell us the energy, to bring in, where smart meters exist, a cheaper price to use electricity at times of low demand. So to shift your usage away from 7 to 9 in the morning and from 6 to 10 in the evening, or 6 to 8, that peak that we all see, because that's where the price goes out of sync, because demand, the supply demand. So the opportunity really is in offshore, where we've significant amount of energy, electricity I should say, but the price of that electricity has to be below a certain threshold for it to be diverted into hydrogen. So you need electricity to make the hydrogen, so the price of the electricity has to be below. So if you're going to buy that electricity off the market, you've no hope. But if you have excess energy that, under the current policy and the current markets, if you're producing wind when there's no demand, you're asked to turn off your wind turbine. So it's leaving that wind turbine on and producing energy at that time starts to make sense. But I mentioned markets earlier. The whole market is dependent on. So if you were to put a plant to produce hydrogen tomorrow, you really want to be finding people who are going to give you very cheap or almost free electricity to produce it. Otherwise, the cost of production. And then if it's going to be part of the solution, which I think it is a longer term play, it's going to need significant supports in terms of subsidies to get it into the market and to get it established in the market. I mentioned buildings. It is already having a role to play in transport. And you can see transport is a big percentage of our problem in Ireland, but also in this region. So hydrogen in transport has a much better chance, because the price of fuel for transport is much higher than the price of electricity or heat for our homes.
Okay, so I mean, maybe we'll go back a little bit to what Jim said. Cheap power. Weren't they saying that nuclear was going to cost almost nothing 40 years ago? Wasn't that the argument for putting nuclear plants in place? And it didn't quite work out like that because of the accidents that we have seen in different places in Europe and in the US. But that's a very interesting comment on the hydrogen. So you do see a future in it, but it's using the excess energy that would be created in some other form, such as wind turbines.
Yeah.
So,
and I present a module here on energy recovery and utilisation. Now it's not at that national or global level, but essentially going back to energy efficiency, all of these waste energies that we have and waste available energies, if we can collect all of those as well, that's a significant part. But some of that is going to be waste electricity, because its capacity is there, the wind is blowing, but it's 2 a.m. in the morning and there's nothing switched on. That's the opportunity.
Okay, thanks. I'm looking at my watch here and I see that we're coming up close to the time, but I have one more question for Deirdre.
Okay.
And it's a question about whether or not the EU was correct in imposing sanctions on Russia to stop it or to reduce the fossil fuels import. Should the EU have spent more time beefing up the production of environmentally friendly substitution fuels? In other words, instead of concentrating on Russia, should we have really pulled out all the stops to ensure that we were ending up with the things that Paddy was talking about there, renewable energy?
Well, I know, I wouldn't think so. I think we had to move quickly with sanctions, or Europe had to move quickly with sanctions, because the money we were paying was bankrolling Putin to fund his army. It was going straight to fund the war in Ukraine. So I think we absolutely had to bite the bullet and impose those sanctions. And it weren't just on oil imports, it was coal and coal and gas, oil, but and also in other areas. I mean, with the spare parts or high tech equipment. So, and some people would say at this point, well, we don't see that the sanctions were working. Well, they absolutely are working, because Putin was getting a big price for his energy, or for his fuel from Europe. He's not getting that so much in other markets now, and like Aeroflot isn't flying, or has been restricted to fly. We hear stories they're not getting spare parts for machinery, for their tech equipment. So sanctions had to be put in place. I mean, there was an immediate case. Now, it was most difficult, I would say, for Germany. I said that at the beginning. It was most difficult for Germany. But in the face of a crisis where you have this invasion, an aggressive invasion of a member state that wants to preserve its own identity, its own integrity as an international country, I think we had to stand up to it, because when it's Ukraine now representing European values, but they may be different for everybody here, but it's Ukraine today, and will it be Europe after that? So we have to stand to it.
Okay, so 1 minute for everybody, just to wrap things up.
In relation to that, I mean, the point is the sanctions on Russia, there was no choice, but they're not as effective as they could be, because the Chinese, the Indians, they are buying Russian energy.
Not at the same price.
Not at the same price, but they're still selling. They're selling the energy. They're getting revenues. I think the whole European energy security crisis we're talking about today is symbolic of political failure at a European level to address this issue. Back in 1974, I think it was, when the first USSR German gas pipeline was put in place, NATO wrote to Germany warning of creating an over-dependence on an unstable political entity like the USSR. The German response was, from the German government, we guarantee that Russia will never import more than 10% of its energy requirement from the USSR. How did that work out?
Okay. Right, Paddy, one minute for you. Just
very hard to follow that one,
isn't it?
To say as a wrap up. But I suppose it's the word I've been using this week, and it's been a bit of a buzzword. Rather than it all be doomsday. And I think, to go back to the question to Deirdre, she mentioned it herself. It takes a long number of years to develop renewables, to get through the process. So it's 9 years for wind, and I think 9 is a bit in an Irish context. You're talking 10, 12 years to get a project from initial inception through to commissioning. Solar is probably 4 to 5 years. I'd agree with that one. So you can't turn that tap on overnight. We can't turn off the fossil fuel tap overnight either. Jim has alluded to that. You can't just turn off the energy system. So we have to transition. So I suppose the positive piece that I would take from this is, as southeast region in Ireland, we've identified the potential. We know the technologies are there. The big requirement is infrastructure. And I was over in Brest in the western tip of France at a project about 6 months ago. And they're our closest neighbour now in Europe because of Brexit. So we have a huge opportunity, as part of that interconnector and electricity, but also maybe in other forms, whether it's hydrogen in the future. And they are big infrastructure projects. Like, for example, a district heating system for Waterford City. They're big infrastructure projects. They're as big as motorways, and we all saw how motorways got developed here in the noughties. That's where the action needs to be now. If we can put the infrastructure in place, so build the motorways to transport the clean energy, whether that's electricity or whether it's clean gas or whether it's bioethanol or biofuels, rather than importing them. And I'll finish by saying today, and I'm quoting Mary Donnelly, who's the former DG Energy Director who launched our Southeast Energy Agency 2 weeks ago, we in this country increased our imported fossil fuel dependency from 84% to 87% in 2021. That's before the war in Ukraine, and that accounts for €1 million every hour. So we in Ireland are exporting €1 million in cash every hour, every day, presently.
A very sobering thought. I'm really sorry to all the people.
Do I get a minute? Or have I had it?
You had your minute. Well, another minute. One more minute. So, okay, we'll give you one more minute.
No, I just wanted to, well, if I was going in my head, what I wanted, there's nothing like a crisis, I would say, to move things forward. We're living in a crisis in the war in Ukraine and the climate crisis. And I would just hope, and we've seen with COVID that brought Europe closer together in terms of healthcare, doing more in the healthcare area, and as well now with this crisis that I think with Europe we have this opportunity to do more and to pull together. And I hope that we don't get any splintering around the edges. But I do think we have that cohesion now. We realise that like Germany can't go off doing its own thing. Everybody's in this together.
Excellent. Listen, I just want to apologise firstly to the people who sent in the questions. There's about 30 questions there which we haven't been able to get to, and the panel have been working extremely hard to answer all the questions that have been asked. And I really want to thank you so much for this fascinating, I found it intriguing, fascinating, brilliant discussion on this subject. So thank you to Deirdre, Jim and to Paddy. I also want to thank you, the listeners, for listening to us, for coming here today, for watching it online. And I in particular want to thank our colleagues in the European Movement Ireland who made all this come together. And I would just say that there is an evaluation form available on Slido for those of you who want to give us some comments on the thing. For us in the European Commission, it's fantastic to be able to go out and listen to these debates and talk to people about these sort of subjects, and in particular a subject like energy, which is so important at the moment. One final word, Sinead from our local Europe Direct Centre here in Waterford has set up a little table outside with information on everything European. So she's a great resource, and she's based in the City Library here in Waterford. So anything that you want to know about Europe, talk to Sinead. She's also got some publications and some goodies and stuff like that. So once again, thank you very much for your attention, and especially thank you for the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You want a peaceful Europe. You care about your family, your friends, and your kids' future.
That's why you want to protect the climate and the planet. You stand up for your values.
You believe in democracy and in freedom, and in clean, renewable energy made in Europe. Sure, there's a lot to do.
And we can do it. We're in this together. With you.
You are Europe.